book of 1 Timothy is a pastoral epistle written by Paul the Apostle. It's one of his final letters to his protege and spiritual son, a young pastor named Timothy. And although the letter is intended for his ministry life, the content transcends and applies to the Church of Jesus Christ. Within this letter is the most explicit and complete instructions for church leadership and administration. Not only is the Christian's character of utmost importance, but also the church's culture is of spiritual significance. From the qualifications of elders and deacons to the quality of the times and seasons, this letter teaches the believer to guard the truth of the gospel against spiritual treason. And that is why 1 Timothy is a perfect template to follow for life and ministry. Because when we submit to the inspiration and course correction of this letter, the church will be purer, her people bolder, and the gospel clearer. The book of 1 Timothy. Dear church, this is your charge.
All right, here we go. Let's consider where we are. Let's consider who we are. Born once into a family of origin, a biological family. And then Jesus comes along and he says that there's a requirement to be part of his family. You must be born again. Born once and then born again. He was speaking about a new birth. He was speaking about a spiritual rebirth. Paul says to Timothy in chapter 3 of our epistle that he wanted to come in person, but if he's delayed, he's writing this letter so as to instruct the church in how they are to conduct themselves in the household of God, in the family of God. He's saying our Heavenly Father and his children have a standard. We have our own family of origin, how we are to interact with one another, and get this, how we are to interact with the world around us. Jesus said, the world's gonna know you're my disciple by the way you love each other. By the way we love each other. That's how the world is gonna say, those people are different. He also identified the church as the pillar and ground of truth. Based on the word of God, we have everything that God wanted us to have that would lead to life and godliness. Remember, Paul said to Tim in chapter 3, tell the people physical exercise is profitable, but not as much as spiritual exercise. Train yourselves unto godliness. So with that in mind, where are you? You're in church, or you are the church. Which one? To be in church, a lot of the times it has a spiritual, let's say, momentum. I was raised in a Catholic home, so I followed suit naturally. I was raised in a Christian family. I followed suit naturally. But neither of those scenarios and others make you a born-again believer. And I think that's where we go wrong. I think because we've only accepted our first family of origin, even if it's called something like a Christian family. I was raised in a Christian family. That's how I've always identified my upbringing. I was raised in a Christian family. But being born into a Christian family is not the same as being born again into God's family. That's the punchline. One is based on our blood. The other is based on his blood. This changes everything. Oh, if I recognize that I am a born again believer, I am a spiritual son or daughter of the Most High God, who is now my Father, and now I am going to interact with you in accordance with the scripture, like we discovered in the first two verses. Timothy is supposed to come alongside older men and treat them as if they were his very own father. Come alongside older women and treat them as if they were his very own mother. You get the point. Brothers, sisters, and interact with them in such a way that it's God glorifying. Now, he's not done. He's actually going to introduce us to a category of individual in the early church that required tending to. And it's often these types of passages that are overlooked or skipped altogether. And I'll be honest, I'm not going out of my way to preach and teach a message like this. And you'll see the content in a second. But because it's in the way, we're going to cover it. Let's begin in verse 3. Honor widows who are really widows. The word honor here is not just give respect and reverence. That's one form of honor. The word honor here, just to help you understand, is related to the word honorarium, which is actually financial. So right away, he's saying there's a financial benevolence or compensation that goes to a certain category amongst us. And he says, honor widows who are really widows. Now, Bible students, we stop and we ask the question, who are really widows? The text is going to give us the answer. The word widow here, the noun of that word is hera. Hera is the feminine form of the adjective heros. It means this: to be bereft, robbed, having suffered loss. That's what the word widow means. The imagery that comes with the word is often applied to a city that went barren or that was depleted of all its resources. For whatever reason, that's how the word widow was applied, especially in the first century. This woman, and it was gender specific, not that a man can't be a widower, but the text is lent to the women. Now, as we work our way through this, I need you to understand your life is like a fingerprint, and the circumstances that come with your life need to be handled in accordance with the scripture, but also tended to, customized to you. A good minister, a good church will look at you and your circumstances and try to provide whatever spiritual wisdom or physical support we can. I want to be very clear with that up front. This woman is without covering, without a husband. This includes women who lost their husband in any fashion. Death, divorce, desertion, prison, or duty. Sometimes the husband was called off to sea duty or military duty and never returned. So this woman is exposed. She is uncovered. She's vulnerable. She is bereft in accordance with the definition of that word. Now, right away, this expands the church's responsibility. We are to care for women who have no man to care for them. That sounds straightforward, right? Well, there's some nuances. First and foremost, I want to know what does God say? What is God's heart on the matter? Well, God's heart is for the orphans and widows and strangers, which is a word that actually meant those that didn't have any support, okay? Now, as you make your way through the Bible, it's pretty remarkable. In actual Psalm 68, verse 5, you're going to read about the God we serve as a father to the fatherless. He is a defender of widows, Psalm 68, verse 5. It's reiterated in Psalm 146, verse 9. It says something very similar about God's tender care to the fatherless, orphans, and widows. In Proverbs 15:25, again, God has a heart for those who are exposed. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 18, Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 19, all of which express God's laws to care for this category. God expects his people to provide and protect the needy. That's Exodus chapter 22, verse 22. That's Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 17. And through the prophet Isaiah, he cried out this: learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, and plead the cause of the widow, Isaiah 1:17. So there was something going on in what we call Bible times that is now being adopted in New Testament times, and the church's responsibility. God lays out his heart for widows, orphans, and the vulnerable. Israel picks up that heart and is told to treat the women, widows, children, and strangers amongst them with the same care that the Father in heaven would. And now the New Testament church is given the same instructions. Now, what we got to understand is during these times, women, specifically children, additionally, didn't really have any standing in community. Jesus, yes, was the one that elevated the status of women in community. Now, as the church began, history tells us in Acts chapter 6, the basis for the development of what we call deacons. Do you know why they developed deacons in the church? It's because there was a problem with the widows. The Jewish widows, and there were the Greek widows. The argument was, you are forgetting to tend to the Greek widows and you're favoring the Jewish widows. So the early church leaders, they said, okay, if that's the case, we're not gonna stop our prayer and studying of the word, the mission that we're on. So they developed what is called deacons. That was the foundation of what is called a deacon, to serve the tables. And there was a very long list of needs. Interesting to note that. James would write this: pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Now put this together. Some translations say true religion. That's appropriate, the word pure and the word undefiled. The word pure is the word cleansing, being cleansed. Undefiled, spotless or blameless, if you will. This is the first external description of religion, that your faith would have skin and you would demonstrate your faith through your works. How do I do that? He's like, visiting orphans, those that are fatherless, they're exposed, they don't have any support, and widows, those who are husbandless in their trouble. And by the way, it's not just external, it's internal. Keep yourself unspotted from the world. Never take one verse without explaining the context. Remember, in James 1, we have those most famous verses that we're not to just hear the word, we are to finish, do the word. Those are the verses that precede this verse. But he's not done. James is like, hey, how about not just hearing the word? How about doing the word? How about not being a forgetful hearer, like a man who looks at himself in the mirror, walks away, forgets what type of man he is with a reflection in the mirror, so he comes back. He goes, no, how about you look into the perfect law of liberty? How about you do the word? And then he says this: if anyone among you thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is worthless. Wait, what? Yeah, he's like, hey, hear the word, apply the word. By the way, it's not about your external traditions and rituals, because you can put on a good front and you can make this look really good. Meanwhile, on the inside, you're deceiving yourself, and your tongue and how you speak is betraying you. Your religion is worthless. Cue verse 27. You want true religion? You tend to the orphan and widow. You keep yourself unspotted from the ills of the world. What is he laying out? Not the definition of true religion. He's laying out the demonstration of true religion. He just uses orphans and widows as his case study. Who amongst us, he's convincing the church, who amongst us is uncovered and exposed and vulnerable and has no family support? Widows and orphans. So please understand, he's not giving the actual definition of true religion. He's giving the demonstration of true religion. True religion covers the vulnerable and cares for those in trouble, period. That's it. What does true religion do? Covers, that's the word, the vulnerable, the exposed, and it cares for those in trouble. Now, we understand from civilization to civilization, it's often women, children, and the elderly that are the most vulnerable. That's biblical, right? We often let the culture try to determine and decide how we should conduct ourselves. Like the progressive movement wants to level all of those, let's say, disparities, those differences in man and woman, right? And yet the Bible's like, no, the woman is always gonna be the weaker vessel. Not weaker intellectually, not weaker in your gifting, not weaker in your character, weaker physiologically. And the man is supposed to be the protector, right? And the home was a mini microcosm of how God intended the church home to be. The difference is in the home, the man is the head, he's the covering. If the man is out of place, the home, the wife, and the children are exposed. They're more vulnerable if the man is not in his rightful biblical place. The difference is no man in the church is the head of the church. Jesus is the head of the church. But he has put in place men, qualified men, chapter 3 in our study, characterological qualifications of men who should be under shepherds in his proxy or stead. It's his body. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, when we get back to the idea of supporting widows, I think it's wise to first call out the men of the church to be the front lines of protecting and providing for our family of origin, but also protecting those amongst us in this spiritual family of origin. See, this world would love to expose women, children, and the elderly. They are. That's the enemy's tactic. Recently, this happened in broad daylight. See, what was once known as the Title IX of the Education Amendment of 1972, which was a lid. A lid, not that a woman couldn't go beyond the lid, it was a lid that protected women and girls. It was a lid that covered at a time where women didn't have status, specifically voting status. This was implemented so that women can rise and not be discriminated against for their sex. Unfortunately, true to the spirit that's driving the White House, the Biden administration recently changed the definition of the word sex to include gender identity, so as a law that was a lid intended to protect women and girls in all types of public spaces now opens up those spaces to men biologically who are pretending to be women who can now enter into any of those spaces, whether locker rooms, whether bathrooms, whether sporting teams. That's insanity. That's depravity. The law was a lid, and now when it's removed, filth can flood in. Speaking of lids, lids are there to cover. On Friday of this past week, I was waiting for my brother, Bill, so we can go for a walk. And I was outside on our sidewalk, that side, and the weirdest thing happened. I fell through the sewer. Yes. It felt as if the earth beneath my feet gave way, and it did. Both my feet went into the sewer and my body hit the sidewalk, and now I am disoriented and I am completely confused. I was embarrassed. I thought, how did I not see a hole in the sidewalk? And then it dawned on me. It's because there wasn't a hole in the sidewalk. The entire lid, like a plate, shattered when I stepped on it. My first thought, as God is my witness, my first thought when I stood up in my mind was, better the shepherd than the sheep. And I literally was like, out of all the people that walk on that sidewalk, what are the odds of it being one of the pastors of the church. And there was an encouragement there knowing that, man, what if another kid or a woman or the elderly walked on that? And that's what sent me on this little mini diatribe. The men of the church should be the ones that if we're gonna step on a lid that's compromised or exposed, we're the ones that go down, not women and children. And the same can be said, and it should be true for us as we tend to the category that Paul tells Timothy to be mindful of, the widows amongst us. He then says this, in case you think it's only the church's obligation. Verse 4, if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Notice what he says there. He is saying, yes, the church is a spiritual family, and the church is made up of separate families. And the church is supposed to support the families and women or widows that don't have any support themselves. But if there is children and grandchildren, they are the first line of defense. They are the spiritual, social security. Isn't that interesting in a day and age where that responsibility can be easily passed off? Out of all of the miracles that Jesus did, many of which involved resurrections, and if you study the resurrections, the amount of people he resurrected or the Old Testament examples of resurrection, you discover that it always had a widow involved. There's something to that. Now, what's the point? The point is Jesus had to come and correct the religious leaders, how they were conducting themselves when it came to taking care of their own parents. I mean, that's the circle of life. Our parents took care of us. Our parents changed our diapers. Our parents fed us, provided for us, and at the end of their life cycle, the responsibility falls to the children or the grandchildren. That's the right way according to the scriptures. Now, that's gonna look differently for all of us. Like I said, fingerprint, okay? There are mechanisms in place, nursing homes. The point of the account is they shouldn't be abandoned. Jesus said this, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. He said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, and then it's defined, that is a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. Now, listen, the religious leaders would co-sign or advocate for, let's say, men in the religious community who had older parents, and instead of having their assets, their possessions be used to support their parents in their advanced age, they would, a man-made loophole, declare all of their resources, all of their bank accounts, all of their assets, Corban, which was saying, I can't give it to my parents because I've dedicated all that I own unto the Lord. And the religious leaders rubber stamped it. And that's why Jesus was like, you have made the word of God of no effect by keeping the traditions of man. And your, look at me, primary responsibilities as men and women, mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, tending to your own family. I know this is hard to hear. See, the church is a family, absolutely, but it must not replace the responsibilities that God assigned to the family. Did you get that? You know another way the church replaces the responsibilities that God has assigned to the family? Parents, the church is not supposed to raise your children. We only have access to them about an hour maybe 90 minutes a week. The parents are the primary trainers of their children. The church, we support and supplement that. Another way that they made the word of God of no effect was they would pass off their burdens, or they would pass off their responsibilities to the church, when the word said, no, you are the one that should be taking care of your own. According to a Dutch proverb, listen to this, it frequently seems easier for one poor father to bring up 10 children than for 10 rich children to provide for one poor father. Perfectly. Sheila, our servant of the month, what I love, hello? I'm in church right now. What I love watching is my brother Eric take care of his mom. Not just on site, right? But what I know about how he takes care of her off site, right? He calls her every day, makes sure that she is provided for. That's a perfect example. Our brother Eric taking care of his widowed mother. He's the closest sibling, he said. That would be his responsibility, but more than that, he's a Christian. Now let's go a little bit deeper, and we're gonna go a little bit faster. Who's really a widow amongst us? Isn't there requirements? Well, there is. Verse 5, now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. He's saying, who is a widow that warrants the church's responsibility? Not the family is supposed to be the front lines. If there's a woman who's without family support, without children or grandchildren, grown grandchildren, that could take her in and take care of her, it is then the church's obligation. Well, how do we discern who is the qualified widow? He tells us here, now a widow indeed is a widow in need, no other source of support. This woman is truly alone in the world. That's what the phrase left alone means, truly alone, in a state of being without family and without means of financial support. As mentioned earlier, Jesus in Luke chapter 7, verse 11 to 15. Now it happened the day after that, he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him and a large crowd. When he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother. She was a widow. Her only son is gone. She has no one else to take her in. A large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and Jesus presented him to his mother. Wait a second. Jesus went out of his way to resurrect a man to present the son back to the mom because his heart was moved with such compassion that she had nobody else on planet Earth to take care of her. That's the heart of our Lord. It tells us this woman who was left alone, she's not left idle, and we'll get to that. She trusts in God. She has no one else to trust in. She trusts in God. She continues in supplications and prayers night and day. I mean, that should be said of all of us in some form or fashion, that our lifestyle would look like one that trusts in God, continues in supplication and prayers night and day. This woman's circumstances, desolation, led her to dependence, trust in God, which then continued in application, dedication, and devotion, whether it's prayers or serving the church. This is one of the qualifications, there are always qualifications, of women, widows, who are eligible to be cared for, is that they have a heart like Sheila that wants to care for the church. There's nothing in the Bible about serving or supporting freeloaders. Nothing. She trusts God. Did you know the miracle that was performed in Zarephath with Elijah involved a widow and her son? Do you know that? 1 Kings 17, 8-16. Read it on your own time. What happened? God sent Elijah to Zarephath. He said, you're gonna find a widow there, a woman. And when you find her, she's gonna attend to your needs. He finds her, he asks for a drink of water, and then he asks her to bake him a cake. And she says, I only have a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. In fact, I was gonna go make the cake, and then me and my son were gonna die. Basically saying, we're starving to death. This is all we have left. And Elijah says, you make the cake, and the Lord will cause the flour and the oil to not run out until it rains, because there was a drought in the land. She goes in and by faith, with all she had left, made the cake and gave it to the prophet, and it tells us none of it ran out. The story is not about a widow providing for the prophet as much as it's God providing for the widow. Man, let's not forget in Luke 2, one named Anna. Do you know who she is? It says she was a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was of great age, had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. And this woman was a widow of about 84 years who did not depart from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. And coming in that instant, she gave thanks to the Lord and spoke of him to all those who looked for redemption in Israel. Do you know the account when Jesus' parents brought him to the temple to dedicate him? It was Anna, whose lifestyle of faithfulness to serve the Lord, even though she had no support outside of the church, and the church seems to suggest that it was supporting her, the religious structure at the time. And what a blessing. She gets to hold the Lord that she longed for. You know what's crazy about that? You better believe the world that she lived in probably looked at her and pitied her. Oh, Anna, poor woman, poor widow. She goes to the temple every day. How pathetic. She's dedicated her entire life to praying and fasting and serving the Lord. And look how the Lord has treated her. And wow, what is memorialized in Scripture is this widow held her Lord in her hands. See, and looked in his face, Anna's face, and he looked at her face. The Bible says only to such women does the church have a responsibility to tend to. Now, guys, believers have a responsibility to help everyone. We have a responsibility to even help non-Christian widows. Galatians 6:10 is your verse for that. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all. However, especially to those who are of the household of faith. But make no mistake, the church is not obligated to tend to all. There's discernment that comes in. This is why Paul goes out of his way in verse 6 to say this. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. Wait, what? Yeah, he just got done saying, hey, the widow that qualifies, she has no family support. She has no living relatives. The church then becomes her family, and she has a heart to serve the church. She's not freeloading. She's not coming and asking for them to give her financial compensation because her heart wants to see the entire community be blessed. He's saying, but that's not the case for everyone. There are those who are also without family, and they're coming with their hands out so that they can live in pleasure. And Paul's like, they're walking dead. That's a biblical principle for everyone. Without Christ, people are walking dead. This particular woman pampers the body at the expense of the soul. She may come to service from time to time. Now, whether it was an endowment left to her, whether it was some type of inheritance, whether it's coming to the church for financial compensation, she's using the money to live in the lap of luxury. I don't know if you saw this recently. It was astonishing. I had to look it up and then look it up again. and then look it up again. It happened about a week and a half ago. A Brazilian woman rolled into a bank with her uncle. And she was telling the bank attendant that her uncle was gonna co-sign a loan on her behalf. Come to find out, the uncle was dead. Like the Weekend at Bernie's, you know what I'm talking about? She is holding him by his neck, and she's controlling his hand to try to get him to sign the paperwork. True story. And you know what hit me? Well, not the fact that the uncle was dead, the fact that that woman was the walking dead. All of that for money. The desperation for the things of the world. What are we willing to do to get ahead in the world? See, many that come to the church often come with the baggage or lifestyle of consequences from experiencing the pleasures of alcohol or drugs or sex, and they come in their brokenness, and they want the church to tend to their very needs. And there's a time and place for that. And Pastor Terrence will tell you with Laney, the congregational care team and the organization that has been brought to this fellowship and the tending to the needs of the fellowship, the household first. At the same time, they get requests from all over the place, people that come in and they just want a handout. And there's a point to the church sometimes helping. The discernment happens quick. You have to look and go, all right, this person's asking for material needs. That's not their greatest need. Their greatest need is the spiritual need. So in the process, sometimes you tend to the spiritual need, and then you give of the spiritual need so as to help them in the moment. Maybe they'll come back so that you can disciple them and introduce them to the one who provides every need. But it doesn't always work that way. And sometimes the church, and Pastor Terrence has to bear this, has to say no to providing more benevolence or more care or more help. And here's why. Because embedded in sin, God has embedded in sin consequence. And sometimes if we enable somebody in sin, we are only making it easier for them to sin. Sometimes you have to be willing to say, I can't help you any longer because I'm only enabling you. And within the lifestyle you're living is destruction. And sometimes God needs you to let that person experience destruction before he can eventually reach them. See, when we aid people in sin, we only enable people to sin. It's very hard. Pastor Terrence, is it not very hard to discern who should be helped, who shouldn't be helped? Now, we've already laid out some requirements, right? Widows without covering, without husbands, without family, without grandchildren, that have a lifestyle that wants to serve the church, they are supposed to be tended to by the church. But the primary first line of defense within the church is the family of origin, that you are to tend to your parents in their old age. Verses 9 to 16 almost operate as an addendum. They're not going to show up on the screen. I'm going to read through them. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. Now, more requirements, if you will, or I'll call them a template. Now, why is there an age? The age is to help the early church at the time. They actually had a list. If you were below 60, you didn't make the list. The idea is that you still have youth. There still may be an opportunity for you, as Paul would say, remarry, so that a man, the primary responsibility of the home, could tend to your needs, not the church. He's also saying 60 would help them in the multitude of needs discern, where do we start? All right, how old are you? 60. All right, what are the requirements? Now notice, these are some really amazing qualifications. Not unless she has been the wife of one man. That is the same exact phrase in chapter 3 for the elder and the deacon who's supposed to be a one-woman man who only has eyes for his wife. That means sexual integrity. Has nothing to do with marital status. It's also said of this woman, when she was married, she only, and everybody knew it, had eyes for her husband. She is well reported of for doing good works. She lived a life of doing good. She has brought up children. This isn't just speaking of childbearing. It's speaking of child rearing. Some women can't have children, and yet they still, with the motherly instinct, find children to bring up. It says she has lodged strangers, hospitality. She's washed the saints' feet. That was very common in the early days. She relieved the afflicted. She's there to serve, and she's diligently followed every good work. Now, let me move rather quickly through verse 11 and 12. But refuse the younger widows. What? For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. What? What is going on here? A younger woman who lost her husband, initially in that grief, would make perhaps a rash vow to say, you know what? I'm going to serve the church for the rest of my days. And she might find herself on that list. And then over time, right? She's sitting in the seat over there and she looks over to the left and there he is. And before her commitment to the church can be realized, she's got a commitment to the man in the front row. And she wants to find out how tall he is because clearly he's sitting down. And Paul's saying to Timothy, hey, if that happens, that's of course natural. But because she's going back on her commitment, and the problem in the early church was the younger widow was remarrying a non-believer, a pagan, which was pulling her away from her first love. He is not forbidding marriage, as we'll see next. He's not forbidding it whatsoever. He's saying to the younger widows, don't be so rash in your vow. Let's go on. And besides, they learned, and here's why. They're taking support from the church. They learn to be idle. It's the negative form of the word work. Idleness is, listen to me, idleness is not just inactivity. This word idle, it means they're active in their idleness. What are they doing in their idleness? Wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but gossips and busybodies. What's on their tongue is not the gospel, it's gossip. And they're not busy serving the body, they are just flat out busy bodies, saying things which they ought not. Verse 14, therefore I desire that the younger widows marry. What is Paul doing? He's saying reroute them into their specific calling. Reroute them, have them marry godly men, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. And then he drives the nail home. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, let them care for them, and do not let the church be burdened. How insensitive, some would say. No. It's the same premise behind why there are qualifications for the church's leaders. You get the wrong person in the wrong position, and all hell and havoc can break loose. It's the same way the church is supposed to govern the people, and the people in the church are supposed to govern each other. And the same idea of the family of origin that tends to their own children and parents. He's saying, if that's you, don't put that responsibility off and add undue tension and burden to the church's responsibilities. He ends, and I'll end with verse 7 and 8. We're back into the middle of the text. And these things command that they may be blameless. Who's the they here? Everyone involved. The widows, blameless. The church, blameless. The families within the church, blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Why did he say it like that? Because even the non-believing world, generally speaking, was tending to their own. He's saying, not that you're not a believer, he's saying if you're not tending to your primary responsibilities, men, and I'll speak to the men of the church, if we're not tending to our primary responsibilities, our wives, our children, our parents, we are worse than a non-believer. So let me end with this powerful and profound statement. If our Christianity is not realized at home, it is not real outside of the home. Family matters in the church. If you have any questions about how to navigate your circumstances like a fingerprint, please know that we are available. Pastor Terrence and the care team, they are available. I am available. We're available to say, hey, where are you? How can we help you? But we also have a very fine line of who and how we care for the people in the church. So with that all being said, since we're not dead, like that Brazilian woman's uncle, we're not done. We've heard it. By God's grace, let's do it. Let's pray. Father, I pray that this word was clear. I pray your people were challenged, charged, comforted. I pray that we tend to the widows amongst us who have no family support. Would we be like the early church, doing as you've asked us to do? Would we tend to those you've entrusted to us? Would we, like a sewer lid, would we cover? Would we protect? Would we do what you've designed us to do? Would we go first? This is my prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you are in need of prayer, you, of course, can come up. Our prayer ministers will be waiting for you. They're also located in the foyer. Please keep an eye on Church Center with any activities that you need to be a part of. And please say congratulations to Anson and Grace when you see them. God bless you guys.